Be looking at 2 Corinthians chapters 5 and 6 tonight. Are already over there in your Bibles. You can be turning over there. Hopefully you read it once, twice, 3 times, so we can kind of get a flow going tonight. If not, you can kind of read along as we go here. That's one of the great things about these sheets. If you can read, you can know where the answer is, what verse it is, or at least what I'm looking for. Sometimes a little harder than others. But all right, so the think about it question begins to begin with tonight is just a simple question. It's probably one that personally I don't think about enough. But what do you imagine heaven's going to be like? When you think about heaven, what are some qualities or characteristics or even specific things that really come to your mind?
That it's real.
Okay, that it's real. That's pretty important.
It's literal.
Okay.
Be in the presence of God and praising Him.
Okay. Living with God. That's an amazing thought, isn't it? Living side by side with God. Being able to praise and to worship Him face to face instead of how we do today. Anything else?
No pain, no sorrows.
Yeah, that's one of the things that comes to my mind. The idea of just how different it will feel for us to be in heaven than it does here upon this earth. Sometimes, I don't know about you guys, but sometimes when I wake up in the mornings, I have a hard time getting going. Not always, but some days are harder than others. No waking up in heaven. Every day it's day. No night there. What are we going to feel like in heaven? You'll be tired? No? You'll say, well, I don't really feel like this today. It's just hard to imagine how different all the feelings and, the emotions and, never tired, never hurting, never discouraged, all those things. It's hard to imagine a life like that, isn't it? What else? What are some other things that come to mind?
It's going to last forever.
Yeah, and that's, when you start thinking about the beauty of heaven as it's described in the Bible. Of course, there's nothing we've ever seen that's going to compare to it. But can you imagine? Sometimes you see some very amazing things and scenery in this life and in this world. And sometimes when you see it for the first time, just almost takes your breath away. But the Bible tells us about heaven. You see that one time here upon this earth, and maybe the next day you get up and say, man, this is still really nice. And maybe if you stay there a month, you're just kind of like, just kind of gets normal to you. But what the Bible tells us about heaven is, from the moment you saw it, 10,000 years later, you're going to have the same awe and the same, beauty and appreciation and wonder about it that we had when we first beheld it. It's never going to grow old. It's never going to fade away. And that's just something that's kind of hard to wrap our mind around too. What else? Anything else?
Because of it being a spiritual realm, I think it's beyond our comprehension, really, of what it's really going to be like. Because everything we know, experience, and relate to is physical. And spiritual is just beyond us.
Yeah, it's a whole different ball game, isn't it?
How can you explain eternity? Yeah.
You won't feel anything.
Well, yeah, no, there'll be emotion, but like you said, no pain, no hurt, nothing like that, and that's good, because those are the things I don't want to feel. But even the atmosphere itself, as the Bible describes it, it's just a constant state of joy. There's no ups and downs. There's no, one day you're high, one day you're low. It's just an amazing atmosphere. You think about all the people who are going to be there, the kind of people that are going to be there, and just the atmosphere of righteousness. When we read about it in the Bible, if you really stop and you start thinking about it, this place is just amazing, isn't it? It's just beyond anything that we could ever imagine or even wonder. So just kind of keeping those things in mind, if I were to ask the question, how many of you tonight want to go to heaven? How many of us would raise our hands? Okay. How many want to go tonight? Why is that?
Ready. You're ready.
Yeah, we're always ready, right?
But are you ready? Raise your hand if you're ready.
Yeah. Why don't we want to go tonight? Why are we a little hesitant about that part of it?
Unknown.
It's death, isn't it? Isn't that kind of the hang up? Yeah. That's kind of what makes you stop for a moment and, makes you kind of think twice. And if I've always said, if we went to heaven like Elijah went to heaven, we'd probably all be standing at the door. But there's a transition that has to take place. And of course, the Bible tells us that transition is physical death. Paul's going to write about that tonight. He's going to write about the confidence that we have as Christians, and of course that we have under the new covenant, the ministry of the new covenant, as he's been talking about. Then we'll talk a little bit about what it takes to get there, and then some of the things that we have to clean up in our life as Christians. Let's talk a little bit about the idea of a heavenly dwelling place. Paul writes about it in the first 10 verses here in chapter 5, and he talks about one of the ways that he describes life is as a tent. And when he talks about a tent, what's Paul referring to? What does he call a tent?
Our bodies is what he's talking about. It's temporal.
Yeah. Our physical body or our earthly house. That's how he describes it there. Our earthly house, our physical body is but a tent. And why would you think that the Bible describes to us our physical body as a tent?
Tents are temporary. If you said it's a museum where it's a house, they don't last forever, but to our thinking, that's a permanent structure. It's not going anywhere. A tent, you pack up in 20 minutes and go somewhere else.
Yeah, a tent is not intended to be a permanent living residence. It's like David pointed out, generally when you use a tent, you use it for a very limited amount of time. Not planning on staying or being there forever. What are some other reasons you think it might be described as a tent? Yeah, the tabernacle was pretty elaborate tent though, wasn't it? I mean, there was a covering. Undoubtedly, there was a covering that it was made of, but there was a lot of boards too, and a lot of gold and silver and a lot of other precious things that it was made of too. But it was a temporary structure, wasn't it? And God designed it that way so it could be taken down and put up as the children of Israel moved about. They didn't build it and leave it in a permanent location. Generally, when I think of a tent, is a tent very strong? No, it's a pretty weak structure when you're comparing it to a house, isn't it? And again, that's by design. It's just because it's not supposed to be something you stay in for a very long time. As far as, what's the word I'm looking for? As far as eye appeal, how would you compare a tent to a house?
Very good.
Yeah, I don't know many people who say, "Boy, that's a good-looking tent you got there." Of course, today they're probably a lot more fancy than they've ever been before. But generally speaking, it doesn't hold and possess the beauty like a permanent structure would possess. And so, when you put all those things together, you have this picture of something that's weak. You have a picture it's not great, glorious to look at. Not a lot of beauty to behold in it. And also very temporary in nature. But that's what the Bible wants. That's how God wants us to think about these physical bodies. These weren't made for us to live in forever. That's not why we have it. They're just a temporary place for our spirits to reside while we live here upon this earth. Is this body going to hold the beauty that our spiritual bodies are going to have? Not going to be anything like it. Are they going to be weak in nature when you compare it to a spiritual body? Absolutely. A lot of infirmities that come with this physical structure. But it's an interesting way, when you think about it, it's an interesting way to refer to it. Kind of makes you think a little bit about it, put it in a different perspective. So Paul writes about in the first part of chapter 5, he has this confidence that if this earthly tent is taken down, then we have another body, don't we? We have a body that's built for eternity and reserved for each one of us who are faithful Christians. Paul also talks about the idea that he longed for that state, didn't he? Why did Paul long for heaven?
Paul had some, there was a thorn in the flesh of some sort. He was in some kind of physical pain. He was getting beat, almost killed on a regular basis. So there were some physical reasons for that, I would say. Plus, he wanted to be with God.
Yeah, I mean, we talked about it when we began. What's heaven going to be like? I mean, don't you want to be there? Don't you want to go there? All of us raised our hands, didn't we? Yeah, we want to be there too. We want to go to heaven, to live in that glorified state, in that amazing place. You know, that's just far beyond anything that we could ever imagine or even begin to fathom within our minds. And basically, when you read through the first part there in chapter 5, Paul talks about 3 states that we can be in. The first one that he talks about is in this tent. And of course, he's referring to the idea of the spirit being located within the body. Then he also makes mention of the idea of being unclothed. What were some of the other ways that he put it? Trying to find my notes here. Naked or unclothed. What did Paul mean by that? When would we be naked or unclothed?
Not living a spiritual life, for one, because you would be unclothed. You're living for the flesh, not for the spirit.
Okay. Notice verse, what am I looking for? Verse 3, I'm reading from the New King James Version. He said, "If indeed having been clothed, we shall not be found naked. For we who are in this tent groan, being burdened, not because we want to be unclothed, but further clothed, that mortality might be swallowed up by life." So what do you think in that context? He's talking about being naked and being unclothed.
I think that's life and death. The eternal life there. Clothed upon eternal life.
Yeah, and really what he talks about throughout this is, we're waiting for the glorified body, aren't we? When do we get the glorified body?
When we're baptized, is what I know.
That's at the resurrection, right?
Yeah.
We're in a temporary place until then, but the eternal one is when Christ judges the world.
Yeah, when Christ comes back, what's going to happen? Judgment? Okay. What else?
The dead shall be raised incorruptible.
What's going to be raised? Yeah. Remember 1 Corinthians 15? It's put in the ground. It's a seed. It comes out, not like it was before. Right? Is there a state that we live in where we're naked or unclothed? We're not in a physical body, right? Are we in a spiritual body?
What are you in that waiting place with Lazarus, the rich man?
I think you're a spirit, don't you? That's what the Hadean realm is. It's a spiritual realm.
But, so you're saying that you're the spirit, but it's not the spiritual incorruptible body that comes with resurrection.
Yeah, that's when we get the incorruptible body, isn't it?
So basically, when you're in the Hadean realm waiting for Judgment Day, you're just a ghost? I'm not trying to be funny, I'm just trying to Is it a different type of spiritual existence?
I don't know. I can't answer all the questions. It's a good question. But I know this, we're waiting for the resurrection body, aren't we? Isn't that what we're waiting for? And that doesn't come until Christ returns and all the dead are raised.
But you know how it shook out. I never thought about that question. It never bothered me one way or the other because I knew when I die, I know how it shook out.
Yeah.
Like I know how this is going.
Yeah.
So I guess I never thought I'm going to get a different suit at the end.
Well, yeah, and that's, again, I think we spent a little bit or quite a bit of time in 1 Corinthians 15. Lots of questions about it, aren't there? Lots of answers that we want, but the reality of it is I think it teaches, or Paul's talked about 3 different states here. There's a state where you're in a tent, your spirit's in a tent, that's the physical body, right? There's a state where you're naked or unclothed, that's where you really don't have any type of body at all. And then there's a state where you're in the glorified body. That's the spiritual body, when the spirit is reunited with that in the resurrection. And that's what the real thing that we're looking for, isn't it? That's the glorified state that's going to be realized whenever Christ returns with all those who are his. And that's what Paul was longing for, wasn't it? That's what he was looking forward to. So he says we know it's going to come. We know we have that assurance, right? We know it's waiting for us. And that's the motivation, or one of the motivations, I guess, that drove Paul to do what he did. That's what he was looking forward to, and that's what his desire was. So the second part of that question is, do you ever long for that heavenly body promised at the resurrection? I think the older you get, the more you long for it, don't you? Because you realize your physical body is winding down. But we know we got a promise, don't we? We know we got a spiritual body that's waiting for us. We know we're going to get it. Go ahead, Glenn.
Just a thought with the tent was referred to loosely in Job as the foundation being of dust, our physical body here. And so this is all just a transformation and going to the time when we're clothed in righteousness by God.
Yeah.
A fair kind of a step, another step in reaching it.
Yeah, but again, Paul's kind of defending his ministry here. Why am I preaching this new covenant? Why am I doing what I'm doing? Well, I've got this great promise. We've got this great assurance that's given to us by God, and that's what we're longing for. That's what we're waiting for. That's what motivates us. But what does he say? Question number 4 here. What is true as long as we're alive here on this earth?
We're not with the Lord as long as we're here.
As long as we're in the body, we're going to be absent from God, aren't we? And so if we want to be with God, what has to happen? Death, right? The spirit has to depart out of this physical tent or this body. What future, question 5 here, what future realities motivated Paul to please the Lord in everything that he said and did? Talked about that body, that glorified state, that was part of what motivated him. What else motivated him?
Good.
Judgment, right? Does judgment motivate us in what we do and what we say? Yeah, it does, doesn't it? Here's a question to think about, because there's really 2 sides of it that Paul talks about here that motivated him. One of them was fear, wasn't it? Did fear motivate Paul? Yeah. So if I were to ask us the question, how many of you are motivated by fear to do by what you do and what you say here upon this earth? How many would raise your hand? Okay. What's the scariest thing that you can think of in judgment?
Apart from me, I know you not.
Yeah. That motivates you, doesn't it? I mean, that's why in part. Now, it's not the only thing that motivates us, but it's part of it, believe me. That's why we become Christians, right? That's why we obey the gospel. That's why we listen to God. That's why we do what he says. Because the most fearful thing that I can think of is standing before judgment of God and God saying, you didn't make it. No, you're not going to go where you desire to go. You're going to go to the place you don't want to go. So that certainly motivated Paul, and it should motivate us too. And remember, part of the accusation that was brought against Paul was you can't really trust what he says. And remember, he made those plans and said, well, I'm going to come to you, and then some things happened. He wasn't able to do it. And so they said, well, Paul's, he says one thing and he does another one. And what Paul talks about in this chapter is he says, listen, this is why I tell you the truth when I speak. That's what motivates me. I'm going to stand before God in judgment, and I'm going to have to answer for it. And so understand, when I said these things, I made those plans tentatively. They weren't written in concrete or stone, but I fully intended to come and visit you guys. So he talks a little bit about the motivation behind why he did the things that he did. And then he talks about specifically the idea of God giving him the message of reconciliation. Question number 6 is, why did Paul try to persuade others to follow Christ?
Wasn't that what he was commanded to do?
Yeah.
I'm sure there's altruistic motives there, but he was, the way I understand it, he was specifically told to go spread the word.
Yeah.
Go bring people to Christ.
Yeah, undoubtedly. He was hand-chosen by God himself, wasn't he? And given a specific mission to do that. What does he say in verse 11 there, though? Yeah, knowing the terror of the Lord, he said, we persuade men. Well, what do you mean by that?
One thing we have to think about, too, before a lot of this is answered is whenever Paul was stopped on the road to Damascus, we don't have any idea what went on. It's what we read, but, he was scared to death, and he prayed for 3 days after that. So, he has a right to start, telling people kind of like it is. He knows what is going to happen if we don't. We just walk by faith, not by sight, like he did. So we have to remember that too, because of his background, what he went through, and how to keep that.
Yeah, and remember, one of the things that's being questioned here are the motives of Paul. These false teachers have been questioning, well, why is Paul doing what he's doing? And one of the things that Paul points out is, he said, listen, I'm trying to reconcile men to God because I know the terror of God. I know what is going to happen to those who don't. It kind of got me thinking about the idea, I don't know how many rabbits we want to chase tonight. 1 Peter 4, is it? Let me double check here. 1 Peter 4:18. It says there, now if the righteous one is scarcely saved, where will the ungodly and the sinner appear? So think about this idea. If I were to ask you the question, is it hard to go to heaven? What would you say?
Few there be that find it.
Yeah. Even as a Christian, does anybody think it's really easy to go to heaven? It's a challenge, isn't it? There's things that we deal with. There's temptations. There's, patience. There's endurance. Paul talks about in chapter 6 here some of the things that it took for him to actually go and be a servant of Christ. But it's not easy by any means. And so if it's hard for a person who listens to God and does what God says to get to heaven, how hard do you think it is for somebody who doesn't listen to God?
I've always understood the few and the many, because I can put that in perspective of the world, like 8 billion people, and maybe a couple million, faithful followers of God. I don't know the number.
Yeah.
That's I can reconcile that few and many, but when it says righteous scarcely be saved. When I think righteous, I think the few to start with.
Yeah.
That one's hard for me to wrap around there.
Yeah, and I think just what it's talking about there is, again, what it takes to get to heaven. I mean, how many people are willing to do that? You know, how many people are actually willing to listen to Christ and to do what he says? And it's not something that's easy, you know, for anybody by any means. But if it's that way for a righteous person, you know, if it's that difficult for a righteous person, what's going to happen to the ungodly and the sinners? I mean, they got no hope, do they? And that's what Paul knew. Paul knew that, you know, if you weren't reconciled to God through Christ, man, what was going to happen to you in the end was terrifying. You know, when you talk about unleashing the wrath of God, that's something we read about, but it's just like heaven. It's something we can't even begin to appreciate. But Paul, that was part of what motivated him. Yes, sir.
Do you think when he's talking about, you know, that it's not easy for the righteous, that's speaking to not being complacent? The idea that, you know, when we see people, oh, well, they seem very righteous, but we don't know what they do when they're alone. We don't know their thoughts. We don't know what their heart is. Just their actions, all we have to judge about. But, I mean, it seems almost to be saying, even if you think you're righteous, you need to remember that it's not just, oh, I got this, I got this on lock, I got this. That it's not going to be easy, even if you are trying to be righteous.
Well, that's like I said, I don't know. Just think back to, you know, some of the great men and women in the Bible, and when they get to the end of their life, how many do you think would say, "Man, that was easy"? You know, there's a lot of struggles, aren't there, in between, and that's even for righteous people. I mean, it's just it's a difficult thing, but. Again, if that's the way that it is with righteous people, what chance do ungodly and sinners have? I mean, they got no chance. And Paul knew that, and again, that's why he preached. You know, he knew what was going to happen to people, and does that motivate us?
That's a scary verse.
Yeah. Does that motivate us to talk to other people? Because we know what happens, right? To those who aren't reconciled to God through Christ.
But I remember a lesson that you taught one time, and say I go out here and I say a cuss word, God's not going to take me just like that, and I go to hell. You told us that there's, you know, it's not like that we got to worry every second whether we're going to make it or not.
Yeah.
Because that is pretty miserable.
Oh, that would be the worst life to live, wouldn't it? That's a whole other discussion for a whole other time, Judy.
Because the next minute I might do something I'm not supposed to do.
Yeah.
I'm like,
Yeah. But the bottom line is it's not easy for anybody. I mean, you always, you know, there's always something to work on. There's always an area to improve upon. There's always things you struggle with, aren't there? And just not easy for anybody. If it's not easy for the righteous, then again, what chance does an ungodly person or a sinner have? You have a comment, Dennis?
Well, it's going back to this, the mortal and stuff. If we are worried and spend our whole time here worried about mortality, we're miserable. But if we are here and we're already trying to live by the Spirit, then we're with the Lord. I mean, that we have communion. What we say about that? He's here with us. We got to understand that life has already begun. And now we can fall away from it. I understand where I'm coming from. And it ain't sealed until in our life. But we should be able to say we're living with the Lord now. Heaven's already begun, as far as that's concerned, because we're living with God. We're living the life that He wants us to.
Yeah.
But he's talking to Corinthians, and they're struggling.
Yeah.
And because, well, let's face it, what they've been worshiping for years was the mortal body. And here they are turning around now, and all this is coming about. They're not wanting ready to live. They go 1 foot in, 1 foot out type thing. Because there's a lot of pleasure back where there's at. And, you know, I want to live that way. I think that's, so I don't think it's, where he's talking about getting rid of the stuff. He's wanting everybody to understand what it's like to live in the Spirit now, starting then.
Yeah, well, he certainly does. Like you say there, as you go through the rest of the chapter, and even into chapter 6, he talks about that concept, of dying and living in the, I guess the spiritual sense would be the right way to put it. Yeah. But when how do I get off on that? Oh, number 6 here. Do what?
And blame Judy.
Yeah. Number 6 there. Why did Paul try to persuade others to follow Christ? Well, he knew the fate of the ungodly and the sinner. And so if it's not easy for righteous people, to make it to heaven, again, the ungodly and the sinner are not going to have any type of hope. So fear was part of his motivation. Question number 7, what else motivated Paul? Was it just fear? Yeah, the love of Christ motivated him, didn't it? And you think about, again, that question I asked before. Why did we obey the gospel? Well, did fear play a part in it? Yeah. Why do we listen to the Lord? And why do we do what he says? Does fear of judgment play a part in that? It certainly does. But you know what else plays a part in it? Are you motivated by the love of Christ? I mean, do we do what we do because Christ loved us and he died for us? Is that part of what motivates us too? It's not just one thing that really drives us or motivates us, but it's a combination of different things. And so the love of Christ, the fact that Jesus died for him, and the fact that God gave his son in Paul's place motivated Paul. That's why he preached to other people. How did Paul, question number 8 here, how did he change the way that he looked at people? How did he not look at people? Let's start that. That's a little easier. Yeah, according to the flesh, he says there. Not according to physical qualities or characteristics or rank. So when Paul looked at people, he said, I used to look at people by flesh, but now when I look at somebody, I don't look at their birth, where were they born, or what country did they grow up in, or where do they rank within society, or how many dollars do they have, or what office do they hold, or what credentials do they have? Remember the letters that some of these people had that they were showing off in front of everybody? We're important people because these people back here back us and send us. We ever do that as people and Christians? If I have 3 letters by my name, does that make me better than somebody else?
The world says it does.
Yeah. It just means I probably studied some more or a little bit extra than other people have. Doesn't necessarily mean that I know everything, though, or I'm smarter than everybody else, right? That's not the way that we should look at each other. How should we view each other?
In Christ or us.
Yeah, brothers and sisters or not, right? That's the long and the short of it. Doesn't matter what our education is, our race, our finances, our position. Doesn't matter, we could get into a good discussion here, but it doesn't matter what political party I'm associated with, right?
I was a little shaky.
Is that what we're supposed to look at when we look at each other?
Helps.
There's always issues to discuss. Morality, you don't shy away from that, do you? But that's a physical division, isn't it? And Paul says we're not supposed to look at each other according to the flesh. We're supposed to look at each other as brothers and sisters in Christ. And that, if we can do that, man, that'd solve a lot of problems in the church today. Second part of that, what's true about every person in Christ is a new creature. Question number 9 here, what does God do with our sins when we're reconciled to Him? Maybe I should say, what does He not do? Okay, doesn't remember them. What's the specific wording Paul uses here?
Not imputing their trespasses unto them.
Yeah, not imputing them. That's a banking term in the original language. It just means it doesn't go on your account. You know, when you deposit a check, that deposit is put into your account. What does God not do with sin? He doesn't deposit it into our account. Doesn't put it on our record. And so that's the importance of being reconciled to Christ. How is a Christian an ambassador? Paul talks about being an ambassador. What does that mean? Are we ambassadors for Christ today?
Sure. Representatives.
Yeah, an ambassador was basically a physical representative. To do that, you had to be associated with that person in some way, shape, or form. You had to be sent by that person, and you had to deliver the message that person sent you with. And when you think about Christians, that's us, isn't it? I mean, we're related to Christ. We have a relationship with Him. Are we sent by Christ to deliver a message? Yeah, we're ambassadors for Christ. In chapter 6, Paul talks about some of the things that it took for him to be a servant of Christ, to endure or to live out this ministry that God had entrusted him with. What do you learn about the cost of being Christ's disciple from those about the first 10 verses there in chapter 6? What it cost Paul to be a disciple of Christ? Yeah, Paul had to have a lot of patience and endurance, didn't he? We need that as Christians too. Does it take sacrifice? Does it take moral purity? Does it take determination? Sometimes we make the statement salvation is free, and that's true, it is. That doesn't mean it doesn't cost something. There's some things that we have to do if we want heaven to be our home. What lengths does Paul go to show his love for the Corinthians? He used his mouth. That means I think he spoke plainly and honestly with them, and also his heart. And basically Paul says, there's not a place in my heart that isn't open to you. Paul didn't hold anything against them that they'd said or done toward him. He was always open, and he was always willing to receive them back regardless. Let's just mention real quickly here, wish we had more time to talk about this, but don't be yoked together with unbelievers. Question 13, what kind of yoke is forbidden between Christians and unbelievers or non-Christians?
Unequal.
Yeah, and unequal. So here's what I really want to point out from this passage. Does the Bible condemn every kind of yoke between a Christian and a non-Christian? No. Just what kind of yokes? Yeah, unequal. And the idea back in the Old Testament, I think Deuteronomy 22, when they hooked animals to the plow, they weren't supposed to hook a donkey and an ox together. Why?
When bulls are reviewed.
Yeah. One's going to pull them out of the way, right? They're yoked together, but they're not going to be able to go down the straight and narrow. They're not going to be able to do what the guy in charge wants them to do. One's going to pull more than the other, and so it's going to pull the other one off course. And that's the kind of yokes that the Bible forbids between Christians and non-Christians. So here's, I, as a young person, heard more than one old-time preacher, apply this to the realm of marriage. Paul's not specifically talking about Christians marrying non-Christians. You read 1 Corinthians 7, 12 through 14. He talks about how that's a legitimate marriage in the sight of God. God recognizes that. The children are holy. But I do want to just mention 15 here. What areas of life do Christians need to be separate from non-Christians? In other words, give me an example of an unequal yoke.
I have trouble applying that verse to a business context and not applying that verse to the person I spend every day of my life with personally. I would think that one is has a much higher likelihood of pulling me away than the other. That's just, so I've always had trouble not seeing that in the realm of physical relationships and marriage.
Okay, well, I will say this, it could apply,
Yeah.
couldn't it?
Is it a general sense? I mean, just
Yeah, does it mean you can't live in the same city as an unbeliever? Is that the separation that Paul's talking about there? Can you work in the same place that a non-believer works? Can you talk to a non-Christian? Can you share things with a non-Christian? Can you associate with a non-Christian?
It'd be pretty hard to convince people to become Christians if you didn't.
Yeah, so what is he talking about? There you go. Sinful worship? Can we be yoked together with an unbeliever? No. Don't want an unequal yoke there, do you? You don't want to get pulled off into that.
You can also really have a hard time with like a drinking person. You know, it's real hard to have a friend that drinks a lot. You know, you're unequally, because they're going to drag you down. They're probably going to drag you down a lot sooner than you're going to change him.
Well, yeah, there's always that possibility, isn't there? But there's another possibility too. What's that? Yeah, the unequal yoke is, listen, anything that's ungodly, anything that's sinful activities, events, you can't be yoked together in an unbeliever where they pull you into those things. You know, that's the unequal yoke. Can you be yoked together with a person who's going to pull you into ungodly behavior? You know, can you be yoked together with a person who's going to enter into ungodly contracts, sinful contracts? Can't do those things. And so that's really what Paul says. He says, don't touch the unclean thing. What's the unclean thing? Sin, isn't it? Yeah, stay away from sinful things. Don't let a person of the world pull you into something sinful. Don't get so close together or yoked together in a relationship. Like Adam pointed out, it could apply to marriage, couldn't it? Could there be an unequal yoke in marriage? Could be. But if a Christian marries a non-Christian, you better not let them pull you into sin. That's not what God wants from us. Yes, sir.
Two things. So as far as the being yoked, I think of things like you don't work for the hotel that you know is the place the cops are at every night and all sorts of bad things are going on. Because at that point, you're basically, your boss tells you to turn a blind eye. They have authority. It's unequally yoked, and you either get fired or you do something that's sinful. And as far as that applying to marriage, obviously it can. But I think about, let's say, parents and they're Christians, and then they have kids who grow up and are not Christians at all. Well, they're not going to cut them out of their lives. They're still connected to them. They're still a part of their lives, and vice versa. If your parents decide not to be Christians, you still go over and take out mom's trash.
Yeah.
So that's why it never felt to me like it was heavy on this is about marriage so much. It's things that maybe put you in some sort of position between something else.
Yeah. Well, if you were alive, well, I don't want to say that. That's a bad way to start it out. If we lived 50 to 100 years ago, lessons we would have heard from that verse are much different than what we hear today. I will tell you that. But again, study it out for yourself and apply some common sense and logic to it.